How's everyone doing today? My name is Yupari and I'd like to welcome you to this week's portrait painting demonstration. In this week's video we will be continuing the painting that we started last week, and if you haven't seen that video I'll post a link on the description below. For my palette today I will be using, from left to right, 3 dots of titanium white, 2 dots of flake white replacement, raw umber, burnt umber, alizarin crimson, cadmium red light, cadmium orange, yellow ochre, cadmium yellow, sap green, ultramarine blue, and ivory black. My painting setup today is going to be a little bit different from my previous videos. I was using my iPad as a photo reference device, but my iPad is broken, so I'll be working from a TV screen to the left of my panel, but that's okay. I have adjusted the lighting and the color on the TV screen to work just as well as the iPad did. I just used my medium to oil out the dry painting. This does two things. It brings back the values, the original values, and it helps create a surface that is as if I were painting wet on wet. And the medium that I'm using is a combination of odorless paint thinner and stand oil. I have a 1/5 stand oil to 4/5 paint thinner mixture. So let's get to the colors. So what am I doing right now? I'm making a generic mixture of flesh colors of basic flesh tones, and today's video will be on creating subtle colors used for flesh tone mixtures. So this week I will try to explain a little more in depth about my flesh color mixtures. Right now I'm using a combination of my flake white replacement, alizarin crimson, and yellow ochre. My approach to creating these subtle variations of flesh colors is to actually create them on my palette first. So I have a variety of different colors I'm using right now. Cadmium orange, back to the yellow ochre, back to the cadmium orange, into the darker mixture that I had before. And my flesh tones are usually a combination of alizarin crimson, cadmium orange, burnt umber, and white, but I don't always use the same colors. Obviously each situation is going to be a little bit different, but this week I will be giving you just the fundamentals, or the most basic color combinations that I use. My palette's set up so that the warmer color mixtures are going to be on the top and the cooler mixtures on the bottom. Notice the grayscale that I mixed on the bottom. I'm just going to be using that to neutralize some of my colors on the fly a little bit. So for the shadow side of the face, I'm using a rather opaque mixture that is, it's opaque, it's pretty thick, it's not too transparent, so I'm not glazing per se, but I'm trying to maintain the value relationship that I established in the underpainting last week. Again, if you haven't seen the start of this painting, I have a link in the description below. So what I'm using to create these colors, I'm thinking of first the value. What's the value? Then I have the color relationship. Now there aren't any other colors to relate to, but the cast shadow right now is definitely warmer than the gray that I had underneath before. So I'm using a warmer mixture. That mixture just so happens to be a combination of burnt umber, cadmium orange, and some raw umber, some ivory black, and a tiny bit of white. I don't have a lot of white into it, but it was enough just to make the color from being too hot to a nice neutral warm color for the cast shadow. And now to get to the hair, I'm just using a dark mixture. Again, it's burnt umber and actually a little bit of alizarin crimson this time, mixed with some ivory black, but I don't want it to be straight black yet. Last week we did the underpainting in raw umber, and that was because raw umber on its own isn't completely dark. What I'm doing right now is actually just fanning out the painting to eliminate glare. So it's not entirely as dark as burnt umber. Raw umber isn't as dark as burnt umber, and it certainly isn't as dark as ivory black. So this time we have the full value scale. Now I'm reaching my cadmium orange, the cadmium yellow, back to the cadmium red light, into my already existing mid value on the palette. So I adjust my colors. I'm neutralizing that color a little bit, it was too hot. So I'm using my colors that I already placed on the palette and I'm adjusting them, but I'm maintaining the tonality, that is the value of this color. And now I'm going to be just scumbling it on to the painting. I'm painting the color of the side of the face, the side plane of the face, turning into the cast shadow. Let me tell you, there is so much simplicity in starting out this way and having a monochromatic underpainting with a lot of attention to the drawing and the values, because once that's figured out and once it's dry, it really gives you the freedom to figure out what these colors are, because you're not juggling color, value, and drawing anymore. You're just trying to figure out the color and the forms. And not even so much the forms, because we figured that out last week. Mostly. We didn't render anything, but we figured out the planes. This week we are going to be figuring out the color mixtures, and we're going to have that freedom to figure out what these colors are, because we did all of the difficult work trying to get the color, trying to get the value in the drawing to work. Now back to the colors. I like to consider myself a painter of principles and not of formulas. So I'm not formulaic with what colors I'm using so much as I'm thinking what is the hue, value, chroma of the colors that I'm working on. For example, the color on the side plane of the face, now I can probably tell you the mixture is likely to be a combination of cadmium orange, burnt umber, a tad bit of white, and some more cadmium yellow. I just know from memory, painting that side plane of the face, that that's likely what I used, but I usually try to kind of feel my way out with these colors. Of course I'm thinking of the value, but also with color is somewhat of a subjective thing. It really isn't an absolutist thing, although some people may claim it to be, and they may be correct in their own right, but I'm more of a practical person when it comes to painting. I really want to figure out what it is I'm doing. I don't want it to be an absolute kind of thing. I want to feel my way around what I'm doing. So these mixtures of cadmium orange, sap green to cool down, and a little bit of cadmium red are pretty much, I'd like to say 60% of the mixtures that I'm using to create these flesh colors. And I'm also thinking of the color of the light. The photo reference was taken in natural light, probably an east facing window. So I'm also taking into account that with natural light, these colors are going to be a lot more subtle and a little more grayed than if it were from a electric light. I let my colors build on my palette. A lot of painters, or pretty much every other painter that I've met, they have separate puddles for separate colors, and that's probably a cleaner way to work. But I like to have a gradation of values on my palette and a gradation of colors. I just like having that clarity on my palette before I put anything down on the painting. That is, I let my colors build in terms of tonality from light to dark, and in terms of the colors themselves from warm to cool. But then again, I don't think about temperature too much. I think about just the color itself. The side plane of the nose, I personally feel is a little more on the pinkish side, and the side plane of the face is a little more on the orangish side. And I'm emphasizing the ish that I add on the end of these colors because I don't know exactly what color it is, but it leans towards pink or it leans towards orange. So I use that. I use that kind of relation in my head, and then I place it down on the palette, and then I figure out if that value is going to work. Then I place it onto the painting itself. We don't want to be like a cooking book. We don't want to have recipes for what our color mixtures are. That shouldn't be the case. There's so much variety, there's so much abundance in color and tonality and nature that you really limit yourself if you're trying to just stick with a recipe of what I mentioned earlier, the cadmium orange, white, burnt umber, or whatever. It's a good starting point to get you somewhere, and I use it for my first color pass whenever I'm working with just color. In fact, I call it a false color, my first pass on a color painting that is not started with an underpainting. I call that first pass a false pass because it's just a color to build on, but when you're really trying to mix a color, you want to study what that color is in relation to another color. The forehead may be a little bit more on the yellow-orange side, and the side plane of the face may be a little more on the grayed out green. Now these are the directions in which the colors are leaning. But I'm not going to make the forehead straight up orange and the side of the face straight up green. Like, I'm aware of the hue. The hue is orange, the hue is green, but the saturation is not there. Her forehead is not going to be like a stop sign or something. It's going to be a much more neutral color. And how do I get those neutral colors? I can use my black and white and create a gray to mix into it, or I can use a complementary color. But in this case, I'm just using my burnt umber to neutralize that color. What I really want you to get out of this is that painting is not a mystery. You know, it's not like something that I was born, therefore I am. It's something that we gotta work on. It's something that we gotta think about. It's something that we have to figure out. And that's what we're trying to do here. We're trying to figure out these colors. Now, there's hue, value, saturation to a color, and then there's perception. The perception is something that we kind of make up in our head. I may perceive the plane on her cheek that I'm painting right now as a little more on the pinkish side, but it's not like a chewing gum pink, but it's somewhat pink. Now that's how I perceive it. That's what it looks like to me, but to someone else it can look more on the scarlety red side, and that's just a matter of perception. But the color itself really depends on the hue, value, and the chroma. The hue being pink, the value being a lighter mid-tone, and the chroma being not so saturated, right? Her cheek is not going to be as saturated as a stoplight. Not to get too scientific here, but color is a wavelength, as a lot of you already know. Sir Isaac Newton discovered that if you shine a beam of light through a prism, you get all the colors of the rainbow. It really is the wavelength at which the particles of light, the photons, travel. That's a color. Now, value is a spatial relationship of one plane to a light source. What that means is that the value really dictates the form. If you open and close a door relative to a light, then the value on that door will change. Night and day occur because of the placement of the Earth in relation to the light source being the sun. That's how we have night and day. That is the position of the plane of which you are on the sphere of the Earth relative to the light source. Mixing up a more neutral color here, going back in with a gray on top of this warm pink that I already had, and I'm mixing up a more muted pink-ish color for the side of the muzzle of the mouth, and that same plane is carried across to the chin, so I'll be using that on the side of the chin as well. Back to the yellow ochre and some raw umber. I'm creating a neutral green that's a little bit on the darker mid value tonality. I'm using that color mixture to paint the side of the mouth as it turns into the more side plane of the face. It's more of a pathway, kind of a connection from the muzzle of the mouth all the way to the under part of the cheekbone. Now we're going to be getting into some of the darker colors. So I'm going to have a little bit of burnt umber here with some alizarin crimson on top of the value mixture that I already had. And I'm going to use that to paint the dark accent right underneath the upper lid, in between the upper lip and the lower lip. And then I'm going to mix a cadmium red light with some orange on top of the value that's a little bit lighter than that value that I just mixed, and I'm going to neutralize it a little bit with a bright blue, ultramarine blue, with some of my flake white replacement. And with another brush, I'm going to mix these two colors together to get a kind of neutralized warm purple. And I'm going to use that mixture to paint the darker region underneath of the upper lip, the shadow region of the upper lip, as it turns into the inside of the mouth, the accent, the dark accent that we had painted before. Using the value relationship on the palette, I'm going to go one up in value, and I'm going to go a little bit more on the pinker side. So I'm using some alizarin crimson mixed into the yellow ochre and on top of the colors that I already had. I'm going to use that to create a sort of a lighter, more pink color for the lower lip. But I realized I had that a little too light, so I'm going to go back to the shadow mixture that I had, and I'm just going to mix the two right on the panel. Yep, sometimes you can mix colors all together on your surface. That's okay too. In fact, one of my first teachers was actually an impressionist painter and had us painting only with palette knife, painting still life out in the sunrise. Imagine that, mixing these colors using a palette knife, painting a still life in a sunrise. But anyway, I'm using my already established flesh color mixture to shape the bottom lid of the eye a little better. So now we're going to be using the smaller brushes. Back to the raw umber, burnt umber, cadmium orange, alizarin crimson, back to the alizarin crimson, and a little bit of ivory black. We're going to be mixing up a darker and warm but not bright red color that we're going to use for the cast shadow of the side of the nose. Now there are some circumstances when working from life or from a well taken photograph that you'll notice that some shadows are going to be extremely warm. Now think about holding your hand up to the sunlight and seeing the red shining through the connections of your fingers. That kind of red is a transparency that happens sometimes in the ears or in the hands, thin areas of skin. So in this case, the nostril is getting some light shining through, and that's creating this warm cast shadow. Now I'm going one up in value to a slightly more yellow ochre-ish mixture. Ish meaning it's not straight yellow ochre, but it's leaning towards that direction. As we start to turn away from the cast shadow of the nose into the wing of the nose. One up in value again as we're going into a more lighter pink region. For the lighter top planes of the nose. And notice how I keep saying one up or one down, and that's really just as I move across the value scale that's already established on my palette. Remember in the beginning I set up that generic value scale of basic flesh tones, so I'm using that value relationship to adjust my colors as I go and maintain my tonality as I work across the face. Now we have a more orangey scarlet light mixture for the light region of the lip. This is again something that is very, very versatile, very kind of subjective in a way. Lips are usually a little bit darker and a little bit warmer. Not always the case, but for this painting, I'm using that color relation. So I'm relating the color on the lip to the cast shadow of the nose. Cast shadow of the nose is much more on the red side, and the light region of the lip is a little more on the pinkish orange side. Going one up in value again using a muted light pink, I'm going to be painting the light plane of the face just as the bottom lip starts to turn into the face. It's going to be a little bit lighter. And then I'm going to use that same color, that same value, to paint the light planes on the left side of her eye. They're somewhat on the same plane and somewhat of the same color family, so I generalized them to be the same. And now I'm mixing up a mid value kind of towards the greenish for the side plane of that area of the left eye. You're watching this video right now because you want to learn something about color, or you just want to watch the development of this painting, or whichever reason you have to be watching right now. I just want you to understand that painting the colors of the face is not an absolute thing. There are definitely canons of proportions for color mixtures on the faces, but in the large part it's really about the perception. It's really about how you perceive one color plane in relation to the other color plane. And I make these comparisons on my palette sometimes. Notice the two brushes I just set down are colors in relation to one another. So it's really all about gauging those relationships. Painting the planes side by side next to one another and really comparing what those colors are in relation to each other. But remember that the value is of the most importance when it comes to making a realist painting. If you're trying to make more of an impressionistic painting, that's fine. That right there is more about the color, but for the realist painting, it's really about gauging the colors in relation to each other, but always knowing that the value is taking precedence here. This may just be my personal opinion, but I feel like there are no ugly colors in painting. I feel that every color has its purpose. Every value has its place on the drawing, but there are no ugly colors. I'd be weary of the term mud. You know how people may say that, oh, that painting is so muddy. Oh, the old master paintings are just so brown and ugh. No, there are so many beautiful, subtle colors in the old master paintings. And if you isolate the color itself, you may think that, oh gosh, it's such an ugly color. But really, if it works in relation to the other colors, it doesn't matter what that color is. If it's in the right value range and it's harmonious to the other colors around it, it is a beautiful color. It doesn't matter what color mixture it is. Notice the tonality on my palette. Notice how that light travels from the right side of the palette to the left side of the palette. That's really the value relationships that I'm trying to maintain. And each little color puddle is just a variation from that value. You see the lighter plane of the forehead that I'm painting in now is definitely maintaining its value relationship, but I'm also trying to harmonize the color. It's a little bit more on the pink side, but it's not as pink as the pink on the cheek. I'm relating those two planes relative to one another. A subtle color is really just a color that is not so bright, it's not so saturated, and it's not so definitive. It's not a clear blue, green, orange, red, or whatever. A subtle color is a color that you can't quite pinpoint what it is, but it just works. It maintains that tonality and it maintains that color relationship. Now, I'm not saying that I've mastered it, but I'm trying to relate the color that goes in from the side plane of the face just as it turns into the dark light, and the dark light being the closest plane from the shadow to the light. And I used that mixture, and now I'm gonna actually use it to add a little bit of light on the ear. Working my way up on the value scale, I'm now mixing up some straight cadmium orange with a little bit of my flake white replacement, and I'm going to be using that for the highlight of the nose. And once I have the highlight, then it's just time to get a dry sable brush and soften up some of the edges of the divisions of the planes that I painted earlier to finish up the forms on the side of the face. After I'm done softening some of the edges on the side planes of the face, I'll use just raw umber and a little bit of white to paint a background color to frame the face itself. And with that wraps up this week's portrait painting demonstration, and that also wraps up this painting. Thanks again for watching, and as always, stay tuned for next week's video. I'd also like to express my gratitude, of which I cannot properly say in words just because I don't really know how to get the words out of my mouth, to thank you all so much for your kind words and your generosity. It really, really means a lot to me. Thank you.